Hello, everybody. Hope everybody learned quite a lot from the last two sessions. So this session, I'll be focusing on RPA. Looking for folks who might be joining this session. My name is Pranav Rastogi, and I'm part of the Power Platform CAT team, and I'll be talking to you about RPA. These are links to the Slido tool where you can post questions. So please feel free to post it there or post it in the chat window, and I can pick it up. In terms of agenda, what I'm going to talk to you about is I'm going to introduce Power Automate RPA. So for folks who might be sort of newer to it, I'm going to talk to you about an example of how a customer, in this case Coca-Cola United, has been using Power Automate RPA. And then I'm going to be talking to you about some sort of patterns based on the lessons that we have learned. And then we'll open up for Q&A. In case you have any questions, also just post it on the chat. And Manuela, if you can just let me know if I should answer that right away or in the end, that'll be super helpful. So let's get started. This is generally about sort of Power Automate. We want to build an intelligent automation solution for everybody. And the benefits of Power Automate is it sits within the Power Platform family. So you can use it alongside Power Virtual Agents, which was what Ken showed you earlier, with Power Apps as well. And you can build sort of standalone automation processes, including RPA as well. It's designed for maximum efficiency, like it has deep integrations with the Microsoft stack, with M365, Dynamics, and Azure. You can use it as a citizen developer, or if you're a pro developer, you can extend the stack as well. And then from an IT admin perspective, it's a rich COE admin constructs, which you can use to manage. The key pillars are around automation at scale. It's a fully managed SaaS offering. It's seamless and secure. It's simple to use with a visual drag and drop model, and with the inclusion of AI through AI Builder that we saw earlier, now it's easier to build intelligent automation, which you can use for invoice processing, for example. And the newest component in our family is RPA, which is robotics process automation. And the need for RPA is around targeting systems which do not have any APIs. So this could be legacy systems like mainframes, or even systems that are behind IT and are not exposed through APIs. So Power Automate is in a very unique position to be a single automation solution that you can use to access both APIs and non-API based systems, and leverage AI to build your entire automation process in a single offering. And how it sort of brings everything together is, you can deal with the heterogeneous interfaces across APIs, UIs, and legacy-based systems. You can leverage AI across all these scenarios. You can leverage the 300 plus connectors that the service has, and you can leverage the RPA capabilities, and combined together, it gives you a rich visual interface to build your automation and then to orchestrate or kick off your automation through triggers based on schedule or certain events happening in the cloud. This is how sort of UI flows look like. So this is our RPA offering. You can use it with flows. You can pass in inputs. You can record, and you can pass outputs back as well. And you can run the RPA process in two modes, attended or unattended. Attended is useful if you want to have some personal automation that runs on your machine. You can see what's happening. And unattended is useful if you're building sort of back office enterprise scale, where you want to run a job that you want to scale across different machines in a cluster, and you want to have stringent SLAs on it. So this is what RPA looks like in UI flows for attended. This is a snapshot of the gateway clustering dashboard, which shows you all your UI flows running in unattended mode. And like from an architecture perspective, what the components tend to be around are in the on-prem on your desktop, there'll be a designer component that'll run. So this is the UI flows installer that you'll install that allow you to automate both web and desktop-based apps. And then the Azure Cloud Service is running, and this is Power Automate. It leverages CDS. And then when you execute a job on-prem, it leverages the desktop agent, which is the UI flows installer. And then all the connection happens through the gateway, which is running on-prem. It's a shared gateway that we have both for Power BI and Power Platform in general. And we are executing at a fairly aggressive pace. At a pace. We released a private preview in fall. In November, we sort of announced as a public preview. In March, we announced public pricing and unattended preview, which went GA in April. And then we are pretty much sort of on a monthly cadence of new features. Very recently, we announced a post for remote desktop through Windows and sensitive inputs. And we're available in 24 regions and across 43 languages. And the latest addition to our stack has been around the acquisition of Softomotive, which allows us to expand our RPA capabilities in Power Automate. This is the link to the blog post that you can learn about this acquisition. Some of the scenarios that this acquisition opens up, for example, are Java-based applications or like terminal-based applications like mainframes and stuff, which you can now automate as well. So let's spend some time on how Coca-Cola United has been leveraging Power Automate RPA. So Coca-Cola United is the largest private bottler in the Coke ecosystem in North America. Like they have about 10,000 associates, 600 beverages, around 5,000 trucks, around 200,000 plus customers. So they're sort of a fairly big bottler for the Coke ecosystem. The scenario that they had was automating cartridges in their freestyle vending machines. And what this means basically is, let me play a video. Browse to IE. Okay, so this is what they were trying to automate.
Is committed to innovation. And the 7100 series is the next generation self-serve countertop dispenser. Here is your introduction to key.
So effectively, these machines are, these beverage vending machines that are available in universities and in stores, and they wanted to sort of replace the cartridges that go into these vending machines. And so before RPA, here's how their business process looked like, where a CRM agent would get an order to replace the cartridge, then they would track the order in Excel. They would create a purchase order in a line of business app that was running on-prem. Then they would sort of translate the customer and material numbers in a separate app. Then they would create an order in the supplier system, which used to be an external website. And then they would check email for delivery every so often. And then when they would get the invoice, somebody would print out the invoice, like physically walk to the AP department, scan the documents, and then a human at the end would sort of validate the PO and then release the payment to the supplier. Like this used to take them basically like days, and this is a very, very slow process. And due to this slow process, their challenges were it was taking a high time to process these manually. There was a lots of revenue opportunities because they were not able to scale, and then they couldn't invest in strategic innovation projects because all of the time was spent just processing these orders. After Power Automate, this is what they did. They built a bunch of flows as a solution. So they built a first flow, which is creating a purchase order in SAP, which gets triggered on a schedule, pulls in data from SQL. The second flow creates a order in the supplier system. So this is a flow again that gets triggered on a schedule, reads data from, reads the secrets from Key Vault, and then executes a UI flow that automates a website. The third flow was around parsing invoices that were coming through emails. So this was extracting all the attachments as PDFs, leveraging AI Builder forms processing model, the same model that I showed you earlier in the day, where you can do custom tagging. And then lastly, they built a flow which does AP, which is accounts payable. It's a flow that gets triggered and then it calls into SAP. So they built this entire solution to solve their challenges with the legacy app. And let's see a demo of their solution. So this is a public case study that you can also go and see. They had a session at Embass. So I'm just going to play the demo. And let me do full screen as well. And so this is the first flow that is retrieving information from Key Vault, and then it's gonna take each order and then pass it into UI flow, which is automating SAP. So this is logging into SAP, and then it's gonna enter the SAP transaction code. So it's showing you all the steps that were involved in the specific automation, and then it returns the results back to the API flow. So this is the actual flow running. So this is automating SAP, uses entering the username and password. So this is the transaction code, and then this is the purchase order flow. And so you look up your vendor information, and then you enter all these details, and then you save it. And then it copies that number that was generated and then passes it back to the API flow. This is a second flow, which is automating a website. This uses the Web Selenium driver that we have. And again, here it's basically translating the customer and material numbers and creating an order in the supplier system. And so all this information has been got from SQL. And now it's doing a check as well to see if all this information was correct. And then it's just going to go ahead and place the order. And this is the third flow, which is the accounts payable flow, which reads the information that was extracted from AI Builder and then again calls into SAP. It's the same login. So now it's going to enter a different transaction code. It's going to look up the company. And this is the invoice information that was extracted from AI Builder. And then it's going to copy the balance due. And then this is the document that was created. So this is what Coca-Cola Bottlers was able to do. And after they did it, like this is the entire solution that they built, which includes pulling in data from HANA using Data Factory, putting into SQL. These are all the flows that they build. They use blob storage, they use Key Vault, and they're using unattended in a clustered mode from a production perspective. And after they built this, they not only solved it for their call center CRM, but they were able to scale out as a self-service model to their field and their service agents who were able to leverage this solution as well. And the benefits that they saw were around, they were able to immediately realize about 1 FTE savings. And then as they scaled out, they also realized up to 10 FTE savings as well. And then it allowed them to focus more on their strategic investments a lot. And then some of the IT benefits that they got was it's a low-code, no-code offering. They could reuse this solution. It's integrated with DevOps, so it has CI/CD built in, and the solution can be easily shared. And this solution in particular was a joint partnership between the customer, Microsoft, and then there was a partner, Happiest Mind in this case, who actually built the solution as well. So that was how one customer has been using Power Automate. Like we have a lot of other customers who've deployed RPA solutions in production as well. And in the next section, I just wanted to talk about some of the patterns that we have seen as we've been working with some of these customers as well. I think the first thing about RPA is about thinking about the problem differently. It's not about UI automation. Not everything has to be done through the UI as well. If there are APIs available, it's always better to use APIs as much as possible. And in some cases, we've seen customers move away from UI automation to API automation. Examples are like if somebody is doing account unlock, instead of doing UI based, there are APIs available in Active Directory, so you can sort of leverage that. So be mindful of when to use APIs versus UI. And some of the recorder learnings that we've had is around like this ensures a robust recorder and a playback experience. That means that once you record, your automation is going to run more reliably. So some things to remember is you need appropriate permission. Make sure your screen size between recording and playback is the same. The keyboard layout is the same. Use shortcut keys, use a single monitor, don't use dual monitor, and especially for attended mode, don't use the keyboard and the mouse during playback, because it will interrupt with the UI automation that's running, and then it's gonna probably fail as well. And try to maximize the app so it has full focus. And depending on how responsive your apps are, you might have to tune the playback speed to either reduce or increase the wait times, depending on how responsive your app is. So these are some of the recorder and playback tips that we found it to be very useful as we've worked with some customers over here. The next section is around SAP and why SAP is a very interesting question. Like SAP is a sort of a mission critical component of an enterprise that touches all departments, including like finance and others as well. And a lot of sort of business data is over there, and a lot of automation sort of touches this key component of SAP. And some of our learnings over here have been around just making sure that you have the latest version of the SAP client, in this case SAP 760. It has better support for some of the accessibility APIs. Similarly, you want to enable the Belize theme in the SAP GUI. Try login into the server by filtering for the server name. Some of the SAP controls are not discoverable through the API, so you'll have to use the keyboard navigation, so either like shortcut keys or tabs or arrow keys. And since you don't have double click, so you probably want to use enter to drive the keyboard navigation as well. I'm going to show you some examples on how you can do that as well. So this is, for example, this is an SAP Logon 760. So this is the latest version of the SAP GUI. And so here I have 3 servers. And so what I can do over here is I can do S4 like HANA 3. So which starts to filter out all the other servers. Then I can just click here and I can press enter, which sort of takes me to the screen of where I can specify the username password. I can do tab and I can enter the password. Then I can hit enter, which takes me to the screen. Then I can sort of start doing my SAP navigation. So let's quickly see how we can go about recording such an experience. So here I'm in the flow portal, and I'm going to edit this specific flow. So I've defined 4 inputs. So I've defined what's the SAP server name, the client ID, SAP username, and I'm using a new feature called sensitive text for passwords. So as you can see, I'm not able to see the password value, and any value being passed from the flow to the UI flow, like example, you're retrieving your password from Key Vault, then you can set your secure inputs to be true, and then this information is not logged anywhere as well. So here I can say password is test1 2 something, and then in my recording and playbacks, I'm gonna just delete all of my existing recordings, and I'm just gonna show you some of the best practices. So here we have the recorder experience. We also have integration with the Win Automation product. This is the acquisition that we just did. And if you launch your recorder, you'll see that you'll see a recording screen soon. So you can hit record, then you can hover over the application. You can specify your server name here. So then you can press enter, and then it's going to launch a new screen. And another trick that you can do is as it's sort of launching a new screen, you can stop recording, and then you can go back to your UI flow recorder. You can save it, and then what we are defining over here are scopes. So you can have logical separation of steps which are independent of each other. So let's say if this step failed, you can correct anything, or you can delete this specific scope. So I can create a new scope, and here I'm gonna go ahead and record the second step of the SAP process, which is around entering the username and password. So here I'm gonna say record. I'm gonna click on the SAP screen, and so it's clicking on the user field. So I'm going to say input, SAP username, click on the user input box, and then say tab, and say input, and then click password, and then enter into the password box, and then press enter. And so this now logs into the SAP screen. So we can click done, and we can exit out of this one. So if we go back to the script recording, what you will see now I have 2 scopes over here. This was the server scope, and this is the username scope. And since I'm going to be starting my flow here, UI flow here, it's going to launch a new SAP instance here. And the second scope, I can set launch applications to no, which will attach to the previously launched instance. So this is a case where you can use this pattern to attach to an existing process. So for example, you might have cases where you have a command prompt that you've launched and you want to go back to it in the process. So you can launch it first and attach to it afterwards. Similarly, you might have a Word document open where you're copying and pasting images or text. So in the first instance of the Word document, you can launch application and set it to yes. And the second instance, you can set it no. So those are some sort of variations that you can start to do. You can also go ahead and start to change some of the advanced properties around, let's say, how much of time do you want to wait for over here. So we're just sort of capturing the whole DOM. And so you can change this wait after action to be like whatever for your scenario, for your app, depending on how responsive it is. So this is how you can sort of start recording SAP and then start to sort of have these logical separation of the steps then you can sort of delete. So you can go and delete the step, and now you're still able to look up the server and start it effectively. So that's some sort of patterns that you can use for SAP recording. Any questions that I should take now? Let me check.
Chris in the chat window asked, with the playback speed, what happens when the UI doesn't respond in time? Do you have to set the playback speed slow enough that it works with the slowest response time?
The playback speed has to match what the responsiveness of the UI app is going to be. So the slowest is the better. And it all depends what the end goal is, like what's the SLA that you want for your end-to-end automation. So you want to sort of play around with those numbers. But ideally, setting it to the lowest one, which matches the slowest responsive, would be a good practice to follow. Okay. So the next pattern is around leveraging command line. And the reason why this is very interesting is because, like command lines are sort of universal tools that have been around for a long time. And these tools have been used and are still being used to run like utilities or which you want to use to perform certain kind of operations in between your UI flow steps. So let's say you can get a bunch of data and you can run PowerShell scripts to manipulate that data, or you can run PowerShell scripts to get more system information like your host name, and you can leverage that information to look up some other data that you have. You can also use it to run your reports. You can also use it to, for example, log into a PuTTY session, and then you can log into a remote server, and then you can sort of run any bash scripts or any of the other scenarios as well. And an example of a use case where you can sort of leverage this kind of a pattern is around report generation in banks. And so here, the scenario is one of the customers that were using it for us. You run the report daily. It takes about like 4 to 5 hours, and the steps are you log on to a Linux server using PuTTY, and then you run a bunch of scripts to generate the report. And at the end of the steps, you might like email the report or a screenshot or something around it. And so here are some of the steps it's showing you. Like what it's not showing you is a file connector over here, which is used to pull the file from the local Linux server back into Power Automate. And here it's what's showing you is a series of steps which we did to record this PuTTY application. So you passed in the host name, and then it's showing you this pattern of scopes where the first scope was around logging into PuTTY, and the second scope was around launching a command shell, a command prompt, and then sort of entering commands as we went along. And so this is another way of sort of leveraging sort of UI automation to launch PowerShell scripts or command line scripts, bash scripts, any kind of scripts effectively that you can then leverage to run reports or sort of make some utility calls. And things to remember over here is when you launch it for the first time, make sure that you left click on the prompt to get focus. Otherwise, the commands would go to a different window, and you can start entering your values after you do left click. When you're recording PowerShell, you might have to change the application path in UI flows if it's not captured correctly. You can pass in the scripts as inputs, and then it also talks about if you're going to reuse the same prompt in multiple sections of your UI flows, then you want to set the first time you want to launch it, and the second step when you use it, you can set launch applications to false. as a way to reattach to an existing instance of it. The next one is going to be around accounts. So this is an interesting question on which accounts should I use? Since this RPA solution has various components, there's the Power Automate account, and there are accounts used for all the connectors that the service is using. Then, since UI Flows is running, locally on your environment, there is the gateway account that's involved, and then there is the machine account that's involved in terms of what account should the bot use to log in. So there's different kinds of accounts that you'll have to deal with. And you want to make sure that you have a strategy in place which leverages some sort of business continuity as well, where as employees leave, the flows continue to run as well, and you can still edit it and so on. And these are just guidelines to think about, like think of this more as like a brainstorming checklist, where like what kind of Power Automate account are you using? Are you using owner versus run only? What kind of service accounts and where are you using them? What kind of gateway accounts are you using them? If you're using unattended VMs and if you're using clusters, what accounts are being used on those VMs? What accounts are you using for your connectors, either Microsoft like Outlook, SharePoint, or non-Microsoft like SAP and Salesforce? Are you using Service Principal or not? And then what accounts are you using for your Azure resources you might be touching as well? Like, in this case, it could be SQL, blob storage, Key Vault, sort of pick your favorite Azure services. But these are the things to sort of think about. And this is just a sample illustration of what an example could look like. It also depends on sort of what plans you have, whether you have a per flow or a per user plan. But at a high level, you have the Power Automate service account, which could be a service account as well. Then you have a flow, who's the owner of the account. You could have different connections inside of Flow, which could be talking to all these different services. And you could have a strategy where some of the connections are using the service account, some are using Service Principal, some could be using the actual like SaaS token or SQL connection. And then we have the UI Flow connections, which is basically how we are connecting using the gateway to the VM, and those could be also service accounts. And then from a VM perspective, we have the actual VM login, like how are you logging into the VM? Is it a local system account or a domain account? And then how's the gateway configured? So you have 3 VMs over here. You could also have a single account across those 3 gateway VMs or different accounts for all the 3 gateway VMs. So a lot of different things to sort of think about. But this is sort of just an illustration to kick off some thoughts on things to consider when you think about an RPA account management strategy. Let's talk about stateless execution, and this is important because so far, with Power Automate, what you've seen so far is everything is sort of running in the cloud, and all actions are happening in the cloud. But now with RPA, since we are doing UI automation with apps, either running locally on your VM or through some virtual environments like Citrix or Windows Virtual Desktop, it's important to think about how state is managed so you can build your solutions in a more reliable way. And what do we mean by state? State basically means that when you're recording your UI automation, is your UI automation taking a dependency on the state of the app? For example, in my case, I had launched SAP. Like, do I expect the UI automation to start when somebody has logged in, or what happens? And then am I relying on some temporary state being stored on the machine? So for example, am I relying on certain local files being saved over there, and my next run of the UI automation is going to pick up those temporary files or not? So those are certain things to sort of think about. And one of the lessons we've learned, like, and this is one of the customers that we're working with as well, where they were checking delivery status for each invoice, and this was how the overall flow would look like. Where they would get triggered on some SharePoint request. They would create a list of invoices. Then they would initialize these invoice results in SAP, and then for each invoice they would call into SAP to sort of get the invoice details, and then they would go back to the API flow, and then the step would be around getting proof of delivery, for which they would call into a UI flow, which would call into FedEx or UPS through an EXE, and then they would come back to the main flow, and then they would do a combined PDF operation, which would then sort of upload all the files to SharePoint, and then the flow would sort of complete. So this was a very complex flow that they had. Initially, when they were building out this flow, they built these two UI flows together, and so what they did was the output of get process delivery was consumed by the UPS step. And so this would generate files locally on the disk, and then this UI flow would pick up those files and process it. However, from a UI flow perspective, especially when it runs in unattended mode in a clustered setting, there's no state that gets maintained. And each execution of a UI flow results in a creation of a new user session. And that means the app state is not preserved. So you have to start, the app has to start from the start. So you can't really take a dependency between these two operations over here. So a good practice is basically, make sure your UI flows are atomic. They do one thing. They don't depend on the state being there. And any state that's preserved is either pushed back to the cloud, or it's shared in some common location like SQL Server or Excel in SharePoint, or some sort of common location where other UI flows can then sort of pick it up as they get executed further down in the pipe. So that's a very practical example of how would state matter, and how would you sort of think about state management in a clustered setting where you want to design for a scale perspective in terms of running these UI flows from a heavy load perspective. And so tips are like each execution, things to remember: each execution of UI flow on an unattended creates a new session. UI flows are stateless. Don't depend on temporary files, especially in a clustered mode, because since there are many machines, the UI flows can run on, they're not guaranteed to run on the same machine. They could run any one of the free machines. And since loops are not available inside of UI flows, you want to loop inside the Power Automate main flow, and then individually call the UI flow for each of the requests. So for example, in this case, you're looping 40 times here, and for each iteration of the loop, we would call the UI flow for that specific order ID, invoice ID. Okay. The next one is around secure inputs and sensitive text. And this is sort of a key consideration where you want to make sure that you are retrieving sensitive information, which could be either passwords or your own sensitive business data, in a fairly secure way. And this is above and beyond, you already have these sort of DLP policies which will help you govern which connectors are being used in what scenarios. So you'll have some level of protection. But when the actual flow comes in, these are some of the best practices to follow as well. Make sure you're getting your password from Azure Key Vault. So here, basically what I'm showing you is a flow which is using the Key Vault connector, and it's getting the secret, in this case the password, from Azure Key Vault. And then as it's passing those values to the UI flow, we have enabled a flag that you can enable. It's called secure inputs. It's in preview, so you can turn this on. And when you turn secure inputs on, that'll basically make sure that any of the sensitive information is not logged anywhere. So passwords won't be logged as it goes through the UI flow process. And on the UI flow side, what you can do is we have a new input type. It's called sensitive text. It's the same data type as the text one, except the actual value is masked, so you won't be able to see the value. So I already showed you in the SAP example where you couldn't see the password, and here you're seeing those two fields like input secure and input secure 2, which are not visible, the value, and they won't be locked as well. So together with retrieving passwords from Key Vault and then setting secure inputs to be true, and then using sensitive inputs in UI flows, you can sort of make your entire end-to-end automation a lot more secure. The next is how do you think about deployment? So this is like, you've built your scenario, and then what you want to think about over here is like, how do you plan for like business continuity, and how do you plan for ensuring that you are meeting the SLAs that you've been defined for this process? And then how do you sort of have consistency across different projects and deployments? So again, these are also sort of some guidelines to sort of think about. And again, this is not the be all for everything, but these are also just sort of brainstorming exercise, and these are some things to think about. Like when you think about deployment, which could be like, how many machines do I need for this bot to run? Like how many bots do I need? How often should I call these bots? When should I scale? So things to think about, as you sort of think about how many machines you need, is like, what is the SLA that you want for this process? Does it have to finish in 5 minutes? Does it mean 5 minutes per invoice, or the entire job? So there are different levels you can have. What is your app behavior like? How slow are your apps? How unreliable are they? How many number of apps can you launch concurrently? Some have limitations based on the licenses that you have. Is this a single shared account? Then you might not be able to parallelize the bots. Make sure that the bots are atomic by themselves. So we talked about stateless execution as well. Make sure that the bots are sort of doing what they're doing, and you have a review process in place to ensure that as new features are being added or updated, that the overall SLA time is the same. And make sure that just from a data privacy perspective, your bots are accessing what they're supposed to access, and you have a BCDR strategy in place for the bots if there is one to be required. That would mean that you, instead of having your solution in one region, you might want to have your solution in 2 regions or in 2 zones in the same region. So some of those concepts will apply over here. And another way to sort of estimate like how many machines you want to deploy the bots on is like estimating how much time does it take for the human to complete the job, and then having some sort of an ROI metric based on that. And then like, what's the load on the system gonna be like? And so for example, if the bot does a the banking scenario application where they're just launching Putty and like a command shell, then the load is going to be very low. But if they're going to use SAP, then the load is going to be very high. And so your degree of parallelism might be impacted based on those factors. And is your load distribution like, is it spiky during the day or a certain month or calendar, or is it even? So some things to think about in terms of what does the load look like, and what's your deployment container going to look like? Is it like a VM or is it a VDI? And like how many unattended VMs are you going to use? That just becomes a factor of how many jobs are you going to be submitting. What's the machine sizing that you use? Like, should you use a memory optimized queue or a compute optimized queue? Like Azure has a lot of different options. And again, based on the answers to the questions above, you can sort of try to answer which one of these machines would be better. And then how do you scale? How do you make sure that the VM is there's a hot VM ready, or you want a cold VM? You have to install, like, the process of setting up a VM for a gateway is around, you have to install the gateway, you have to install the user on the machine, you have to install the apps that need to be automated. So there are some work that's required. So if you want to have some scaling strategy in place, then you want to make sure that you have some base VMs ready that you can either automate through runbooks or something to add and remove from the cluster. And you also think about, from a licensing perspective, what is the most efficient way of running the bots. And so that will sort of also define what your deployment strategy is going to be. So yeah, these are some of the, again, like, this is not a fully comprehensive list and answers, but there's just Kickstarter thoughts to encourage you to sort of think about more of these kind of things as you think about how to deploy your bots. And then do check out our new show on RPA. It's something that we've started just recently, so very eager to hear any feedback that you might have over there. If you want to know about more customers stories with RPA, then you can sort of bookmark this URL. It's going to point you to a blog post right now, which will have a list of customer stories that were presented at MBAS very recently. With that, like, thank you for listening in. I'll take in any questions.